You took the wrong turn again, Sean. How many times are you going to do this? Jane's voice was sharp, cutting like a knife straight into my chest. Jane, I'm following the GPS. We both know you hate reading maps, I replied, doing my best to keep my voice calm. She rolled her eyes, her entire demeanor radiating impatience. I don't even care anymore. You do everything your way without ever considering me. Even this trip, you decided where we're going, when, and what we're seeing. Maybe asking me would have been a good idea? That's not true, Jane, I said, gripping the steering wheel tighter as frustration simmered inside me. We discussed everything. I booked the hotels based on what you wanted. Oh, how thoughtful of you. Funny, though, how I still feel like a passenger in your life. She crossed her arms and turned to stare out the window. I kept quiet, not wanting to escalate the situation. Her words stung. A passenger? I worked hard to provide for us, to be a good husband. And now, this is what I hear? Sorry I didn't get you a private helicopter, I muttered sarcastically, unable to hold back. She spun around, her eyes blazing. See? Even now, you're mocking me instead of admitting that I'm unhappy. Her words caught me off guard. We'd argued before, but something in her tone was different this time. I glanced at her briefly, keeping my eyes mostly on the road, and noticed the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. If you're so unhappy, then why did we even come on this trip? I shot back, desperation creeping into my voice. I don't even know anymore, she said quietly, turning back to the window. Silence fell between us. The highway stretched ahead, winding along the coastline. The ocean outside looked serene, but inside the car, a storm raged. The trip had barely begun, but I already knew it would be a turning point. I just didn't know how much. Monterey greeted us with a chilly fog and heavy traffic. All I wanted was to get to the hotel, drop off our bags, and unwind for a bit. But when we got to the front desk, we were met with an unpleasant surprise. Sorry, but your reservation was canceled, the receptionist said flatly. Canceled? What do you mean canceled? I tried to keep my composure, but anger was already bubbling beneath the surface. We sent a notification to your email. There must have been some kind of glitch, she shrugged, as though this wasn't her problem. Fantastic, Sean, just fantastic, Jane said from behind me, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You couldn't even handle this properly. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Jane, do you think I did this on purpose? I asked, struggling to keep my voice even. You know what I think? I think this is just more proof of how little you care about anything other than your own convenience. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing she could disappear. She pretended to type something on her computer. Sorry, but the hotel is fully booked, she said after a few moments. I turned to Jane. Well, what do you suggest we do now? Sleep on the beach? Maybe if you double-checked everything beforehand, we wouldn't have to think about this, she shot back, shaking her head. We got back into the car. Jane didn't stop complaining the entire drive to the nearest motel. I told you this hotel was too popular. But no, you insisted. You always know best. And now, where are we staying? In this dump? The motel did look, at best, questionable. The old sign flickered as though its bulbs were ready to burn out, and the parking lot was filled with battered pickup trucks. The only sounds came from faint laughter and music in the distance. I grabbed the key from the uninterested clerk, who barely looked up from his phone. When we stepped into the room, Jane just stood there and muttered, "This is the worst day of my life." I wanted to argue, to tell her I was trying my best, but I stopped myself. Her eyes held nothing but cold irritation. "It's just one night, Jane. Tomorrow we'll move on," I said tiredly, dropping the bags by the bed. "If we even make it through the night in this place," she muttered, tossing her bag onto the bed and heading to the mirror to adjust her hair. I stepped outside to clear my head. In the distance, I could still hear faint voices and laughter. I noticed a group of men near the pickups in the parking lot, talking loudly and laughing. One of them looked in my direction, smiled, and said something to his friends. I turned away. I had a feeling it was going to be a long night. When I returned to the room, Jane seemed a little livelier. She was sitting by the window with a bottle of water, looking out at the parking lot. "You were gone a while," she said without turning her head. I needed some fresh air, I replied, taking off my jacket and collapsing into a chair. We sat in silence until she finally broke it. It looks like someone else is staying here too. Those guys from the parking lot, they invited us to join their party. I looked up. A party? Are you serious? She shrugged, as if it didn't matter. Yeah, they were nice. Said they wouldn't mind getting to know us. There's nothing else to do around here anyway. You mean you already talked to them? I frowned. Yeah, I stepped outside for a minute. They came over and started a conversation. What was I supposed to do? Ignore them? Her tone was indifferent, as though it wasn't a big deal. And you thought hanging out with a bunch of random guys at a dingy motel was a good idea? The sarcasm in my voice was sharper than I intended. She rolled her eyes, standing up from her chair. Sean, you're so boring. It was just a joke. Relax, they seemed like decent guys. But there was something in her voice, light, almost playful, that I hadn't heard in a long time. It threw me off balance. You seem a little too relaxed, Jane, I said, watching her closely. Oh, stop it. She waved dismissively and headed toward the bathroom. I wanted to say more, but I held back. After all, it was just one night, and we'd be gone by morning. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. We went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Outside, I could hear the noise. Music, laughter, loud voices. The so-called party was in full swing. I turned to Jane. She lay on her side of the bed with her eyes closed, but her breathing was uneven. Do you hear that? I asked, hoping for some kind of reaction. Yeah, she replied without opening her eyes. Just ignore it. They're having fun. But I couldn't ignore it. The sounds of laughter and conversation grew louder, and an inexplicable sense of unease began to creep over me. At one point, I heard one of the men shout her name. Jane. I sat up in bed and went to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain. The men were still there in the parking lot, standing in a circle, drinking beer and laughing. One of them noticed me watching, raised his bottle, and nodded in my direction. I returned to bed, trying to dismiss it, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Jane, however, seemed calm, too calm. It's fine, Sean, she said softly, still not opening her eyes. Just relax. Her words felt like a mockery. I woke up suddenly. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of a streetlight filtering through the drawn curtains. Something felt off, uneasy, unsettling. I reached over to touch Jane, but her side of the bed was empty. Jane. I called quietly. There was no response. I sat up and looked around the room. Her belongings were still there, but she was gone. I got out of bed, my heart pounding. Maybe she'd just gone to the bathroom or stepped outside. I checked the bathroom, empty. Then I went to the window and looked out. The parking lot was nearly deserted, with only a couple of cars under the dim glow of the streetlights. The same pickups were still there, but now it was strangely quiet. The endless party had either ended or shifted into something else. Damn it, Jane. Where are you? I muttered, pulling on a t-shirt and shoes. I left the room and headed to the front desk. In the stillness of the night, my footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. The clerk, a young guy who looked exhausted, glanced up at me with sleepy eyes. Excuse me, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Have you seen my wife? She might have come by or asked for something. He hesitated, his expression puzzled. No, sir, haven't seen anyone. It's been quiet here all night. I nodded, even though his answer gave me no reassurance. The knot of unease in my stomach tightened. On my way out, my gaze fell on the far-off room where the men had been earlier. The light inside was still on, though the other rooms were dark. Clenching my jaw, I walked toward it. The closer I got, the harder my heart pounded. Fear gripped me. I didn't know what I'd say or do if I opened that door and found Jane inside. I knocked, softly at first, then louder. After a few seconds, the door creaked open, revealing one of the men. He was big, tan, with a tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve. What do you want? His voice was gruff, almost annoyed. Sorry to bother you, I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. I'm looking for my wife, Jane. She might have come by here. He gave me a mocking look, then glanced over his shoulder as if checking something. From inside, I could hear muffled voices and faint laughter. "Jane, huh?" he said, squinting slightly. "Maybe she was here." "So what?" "What do you mean, maybe she was here?" I felt the blood rushing to my face. "Is she here now?" He smirked but didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door wider. I caught a glimpse of the other men inside, lounging on the beds. Empty beer bottles littered the table. One of them noticed me and said something that made the others burst into laughter. I was about to push my way in when the man in the doorway stepped forward, blocking me. "Take it easy, buddy. Your wife's a grown woman. If she wanted to have some fun, that's her business." His words hit me harder than I expected. My heart sank, and my hands balled into fists. "Where is she?" I growled, barely keeping my anger in check. He gave me one last mocking glance before shutting the door in my face. The door slammed shut in my face, but instead of walking away, I knocked again, harder this time. Anger and despair churned inside me like a volcano ready to erupt. A few seconds later, the door cracked open again. The same tattooed man stared at me, his irritation now unmistakable. "I told you," he began, but I didn't let him finish. I shoved the door hard, pushing past him with enough force to make him stumble backward. "Where is she?" My voice was firm, loud. I was nearly shouting. The man straightened up, glaring at me with a mix of confusion and annoyance. Inside the room, the other men stopped laughing. They all turned to look at me, as if I were an unwelcome intruder disrupting their carefree evening. "Don't play games with me," I growled, scanning each of them. "Where's my wife?" One of the men, sitting lazily on the edge of the bed, motioned casually toward a door at the back of the room. "She's probably in there." "No need to yell, man," he said with a smirk. Words didn't matter anymore. I stormed forward, oblivious to the man behind me shouting something in protest. I flung open the door, almost ripping it off its hinges, and froze in my tracks. Jane was there, on the bed, with another man. At first, they didn't even notice me. She lay beneath him, her hair splayed across the pillow. She looked content, happy. It was her laughter I'd heard through the door. That was my wife. "Jane." My voice cracked, slicing through the air like lightning. She turned sharply, her eyes widening in shock. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw fear. "Sean, what are you?" she stammered, clutching the sheet to her chest, her voice trembling, her words weak and unconvincing. "Are you insane?" I felt my legs nearly give out, but I held on, fueled by a rage that lifted me higher. "Explain this. Explain how you could do this." The man with her got up from the bed, pulling on his jeans. His face was indifferent, like this was just another day for him. "Hey man, relax," he muttered. This was all consensual. Those words were the final straw. "Relax? Are you sick? That's my wife." I took a step toward him, but before I could get any closer, the other men rushed into the room, grabbing me by the shoulders to hold me back. I broke free from their grasp, stepping back and glaring at all of them. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, pain, and betrayal. I looked at Jane. She sat there, clutching the sheet to her chest, silent. She didn't defend herself. She didn't try to explain. She just sat there with her head bowed, as if she'd expected this ending all along. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I couldn't look at her anymore. "You've destroyed us, Jane," I said, my voice trembling but loud enough to echo in the small space. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me, leaving her and her newfound company behind. Outside, I stopped, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions. My life had just collapsed. Everything I thought I knew, everything I'd built, had crumbled in an instant. I stood in the cold night air, motionless, not knowing what to do next. My life had shattered. Everything we had, everything we were, was a lie. My chest burned with anger, pain mixed with despair, and my thoughts spun in endless circles. I headed back to our room. I must have been on autopilot because I didn't even remember opening the door and grabbing my bag. I stuffed everything I owned into it without caring about order. To hell with everything. To hell with her. Out in the parking lot, I opened the car door, tossed my bag onto the back seat, and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the hum of the motor the only sound breaking the night's stillness. I had no destination, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I pulled onto the highway, barely aware of where I was going. The headlights carved a path through the darkness, and I just drove, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind replayed everything I'd just seen. Jane, her face, her expression, full of guilt but devoid of regret. The men, their laughter, her betrayal. How could you? I said aloud, as if she could hear me. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen. Jane. Her name lit up, as if she were trying to claw her way out of the device and pull me back. I ignored the call. Then another. The buzzing didn't stop, and with each vibration, my anger grew. Finally, I grabbed the phone, intending to turn it off, but instead, I declined the call and threw the phone back onto the seat. Why are you calling me, Jane? What do you want to say? That this was a mistake? I said to the empty car, my voice breaking. I drove on, down the empty highway. At some point, I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. I looked into the rearview mirror. Darkness. The motel was far behind me, along with the remnants of my life. I rested my head on the steering wheel. Hot, bitter tears welled up, but I refused to let them fall. I felt hollow inside. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to go on. The only thing I knew for sure was that I could never forgive her. The phone buzzed again. I picked it up and stared at the screen. Jane. I looked at her name for a long time before pressing decline once more. You're dead to me, I said to the dark screen. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The highway stretched out ahead of me, empty and quiet. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I was never going back. The road stretched farther and farther, carrying me away from that cursed motel. But in my mind, her laughter still echoed, taunting me. The image of Jane with that man flashed repeatedly. Her tangled hair, her satisfied expression, the shock in her eyes when she saw me. First came the pain, then anger, but now something else took its place. I no longer wanted to just run away. That would be too easy for her. She wanted an amazing trip? Fine. I'd make sure she remembered it for the rest of her life. My thoughts swirled in chaos, but one thing became crystal clear. She needed to pay. Not with yelling, not with fights, but with something far more calculated. Something that would make her regret every second of her betrayal. The phone buzzed again. Jane. This time, I picked up. Sean, her voice trembled. Where are you? I hesitated for a moment, deciding on my next move. I'm driving, Jane. You know what? You're right. We've drifted too far apart. We need to figure things out. She paused. I could almost hear her fumbling for words. Sean, I can explain. It was a mistake. I cut her off with a laugh, cold and empty. A mistake, huh? Yeah, I'd say so. But don't worry, sweetheart. We've got the whole trip ahead of us to talk. I'm already on my way back to you. Her tone shifted, cautious and unsure. You're coming back? Of course, I said calmly. We need to finish what we started. I ended the call before she could respond. I realized I didn't just want revenge. I wanted her to feel the same pain I did. To trap her in a situation she couldn't escape. And I would make sure she never again looked at me with the ease and carelessness she'd shown those men. I started planning the details. 1. Create the illusion of reconciliation. She thinks I'm coming back to listen, to talk things out, to hear her excuses. Perfect. Let her believe I'm willing to give us a second chance. She'll cling to that hope. Sweet, deceptive hope. 2. Make her feel vulnerable. I'd strip her of her confidence, piece by piece. Make her dependent on me. I imagined us driving down the same road, but now I'd be in control. I'd tell her everything was fine, but my actions would leave her doubting every word. 3. Emotional whiplash. I'd alternate between warmth and coldness. I'd remind her of the good times, how we met, how we loved each other, only to shatter those memories with subtle reminders that I hadn't forgotten or forgiven. She'd be in turmoil, never knowing what to expect next. 4. Show her what she lost. In the end, I'd make her see the life she destroyed. Not with words, but with actions. I'd take her to the places that once meant something to us. forcing her to realize that none of it would ever be the same again. By the time I reached the motel in the early morning hours, the plan was clear in my mind. Jane was waiting in the parking lot, her face tense, her hair disheveled. The moment I stepped out of the car, she ran toward me. "Sean, she started, but I raised my hand, cutting her off. "Get in the car," I said curtly.
But,
"Get in. We need to talk." Her eyes showed fear, but she obeyed. She slid into the passenger seat, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. She wanted an amazing trip? Fine. Now she'd get one. But this time, it would be an emotional roller coaster that would shatter her to pieces. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. "Sean, where are we going?" she asked quietly. I glanced at her, my face devoid of emotion. "You'll see." Jane sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. She looked disoriented, her face paler than usual. I remained silent, my eyes fixed on the road. The tension in the car was suffocating, filling the air like a storm cloud. "Sean!" Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "I know what I've done. Please, say something." I turned to look at her, letting the silence hang just long enough for her to feel the weight of my words. "I will," I said. "But not now, Jane. We'll have time to talk later." She fell silent, her gaze dropping to her hands. I could see her fingers twitching, a nervous tell she couldn't control. This was only the beginning. I pulled the car into a roadside diner, the same one where we'd once shared a burger on our first trip along the coast. Jane recognized it immediately. Her eyes widened slightly. This is the place," she whispered, her voice fragile as though she feared speaking too loudly. I nodded. "Of course, I remember. It's special to us, isn't it?" We walked inside and sat at the same booth as before. I pretended to revisit the memories, but my demeanor told a different story. I was cold, distant. She tried to make conversation, reminiscing about how much fun we'd had that day, how we'd laughed together. "And are you having fun now, Jane?" I interrupted, my tone sharp. She froze, her face losing even more color. "Sean, don't." I cut her off. "Just eat." She stared at me, unsure of what to say or do next. That's exactly what I wanted, to keep her off balance, uncertain of what would come next. After lunch, I drove us to a hotel she'd always dreamed of visiting. A luxurious place overlooking the ocean, one she'd begged me to visit for years, but I'd always put off. When we pulled into the parking lot, her eyes lit up with cautious hope. You booked a room?" I nodded, grabbing the bags from the trunk. "Yes. You've been dreaming of this place, haven't you?" Inside, I let her believe, for a fleeting moment, that I was trying to mend things. She relaxed slightly, a hint of relief washing over her face. But in the room, I continued the game. I kept my distance, avoided any warmth. I looked at her like she was a stranger. She tried to reach out, to apologize, but every time I pulled away. "Jane, stop," I said flatly. "It doesn't matter anymore." "Sean, please. I want to fix this," she said, her voice trembling. "You wanted this hotel? You got it. But there's nothing left to fix." The next day, I decided to deliver the final blow. I drove back to the motel where it all began. The road leading there felt familiar, but now I saw it through different eyes. Last time, I'd left broken. This time, I returned to close the chapter. Jane sat quietly beside me, her breathing uneven. She kept glancing at me, her fear palpable. "Sean, why are we here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I turned to her slowly, meeting her eyes. "You wanted an adventure, Jane. You wanted a trip to remember. Welcome back to where you destroyed us." Her eyes filled with tears, and she opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. "Get out," I said curtly.
what?
"Get out of the car," I repeated, my tone cold and unwavering. She hesitated, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the door handle. I grabbed her bag from the trunk and threw it at her feet. "Go upstairs," I ordered, pointing toward the staircase leading to the same room. "Sean, why?" Her voice cracked, trembling with fear and confusion. "Go, or I'll leave right now." My words were steel, unyielding. She obeyed. We climbed the stairs, and I knocked on the door. It was empty now. No laughter, no men, just the stale stench of cheap alcohol and something sour in the air. Go in, I commanded. Holding the door open, Jane stepped inside, hugging herself as though trying to shield against an invisible chill. This is it, Jane, I began, stepping closer to her, one deliberate step at a time. This is where you laughed, where you betrayed me, where you destroyed everything we had. She let out a choked sob, her shoulders shaking as tears streamed down her face. I've tried to understand why, I continued, my voice sharp and cutting. Why you did it. But you know what? I don't care anymore. I don't care what you feel. She collapsed to her knees on the filthy carpet, her tears falling like rain. Sean, please. I was stupid. It didn't mean anything. I laughed bitterly, loud and harsh. Didn't mean anything? You destroyed us for something that didn't mean anything? Fine, Jane. Then remember this place. Burn it into your memory because this is your truth. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera, and pointed it at her. Smile, Jane. This is your picture. Your new reality. She lifted her head, staring at me in horror, unable to speak. I gave everything for us. Everything. I shouted, my voice breaking. And you chose this. I stepped back, tossing the phone at her feet. The funniest thing? I thought I'd lost everything. But now I realize I only lost you. And you're worth nothing. Jane broke down completely, her sobs echoing in the empty room. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I pushed her away. Don't touch me, I hissed, turning toward the door. At the threshold, I paused, looking back one last time. I hope you're happy with your adventure, Jane, because this is where our road ends. I walked out, slamming the door behind me. Back in the car, I started the engine and drove away. This time, I didn't look back. The road ahead was empty, lit only by the glow of my headlights. Inside, I felt an eerie stillness. The pain that had consumed me was gone, replaced by a strange sense of relief. I was no longer tied to her lies, to her betrayal. The phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Jane. Her name flashed again and again, but I didn't answer. Instead, I rolled down the window and hurled the phone into the night, watching as it disappeared into the darkness. Now, I was free.